Welcome back. So it's been a busy day for us here covering the vetting of nominees for various ministerial positions at the appointment committee in Ghana. But concurrently, the United States of America was swearing in their 47th president, Donald Trump, who gave a very interesting speech about how he sees the world and what he wants to do with America. He ushered in what he called the golden age of America. He says America was free to prosper. He declared today as another independence, and also came up with some very interesting promises to the world. Let's take you to some highlights of what President Trump said. Before we speak to our partners, the Voice of America, whose congressional correspondent was there witnessing it all. So here are some excerpts of President Trump speaking to the people of America.
The golden age of America begins right now. From this day forward, our country will flourish and be respected again all over the world. We will be the envy of every nation, and we will not allow ourselves to be taken advantage of any longer. During every single day of the Trump administration, I will very simply put America first. Our sovereignty will be reclaimed. Our safety will be restored.
So those were highlights of parts of President Trump's speech. We'll bring you more later. Let me go to Washington now and speak to the Voice of America's congressional correspondent, Catherine Gibson, who was there watching it all. A few interesting points to note: that this is the first time in a few years that this inauguration has been done indoors. It's usually done outside for all the world to see. And I'm told, based on Catherine's initial report, that the weather was not permitting for an outdoor experience. Catherine, thanks for joining us on the point of view here in Accra, Ghana. I guess it's good afternoon in the U.S. still.
Good afternoon, almost good evening. You are right.
Wonderful. We watched your earlier report from outside when you said the weather would not permit an outdoor inauguration. Will this be the first indoor inauguration in quite a bit?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's actually only the third indoor inauguration in all of U.S. history, and the first since 1986, I believe, 87, since Ronald Reagan was sworn in the same spot as President Trump, the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. And one of the logistical difficulties is that obviously the National Mall can fit a lot more people than the Capitol Rotunda, as large as it is. 600 people, in fact. So that ended up in a scramble of people who had tickets to be on the west front of the Capitol for the inauguration and simply just wouldn't fit. But in the end, as you could probably see from my earlier report outside, it was very cold in Washington, D.C. today, and it was absolutely the right decision to move that ceremony indoors.
So wonderful. So how would you describe everything if I were to give you the chance to use a sentence or two to describe both the inauguration and the occasion? What was it like?
You know, this is the fifth inauguration that I've covered here in Washington, D.C., and there's always a sense of ceremony. It doesn't matter if it's Democrat, Republican, what president it is. There is a true sense that the foundation of our democracy is that peaceful transfer of power. You see Democrats and Republicans sitting side by side every inauguration ceremony, and we did again today. when we saw President Biden hand over the reins of power to President Donald Trump, who I should note was not there when President Biden was sworn in January 20th, 2021. But overall, it is always a very somber ceremonial occasion when the United States can take a step back and think about where it wants to go for the next 4 years. And President Trump certainly laid out his vision for that plan.
Let's come to his speech now. First and foremost, who was in the room apart from the people you've mentioned? Because we saw a lot of spontaneous applause and even some standing ovations, suggesting that these were people who were, a lot of them were people who liked what they were hearing, of course, except, of course, former President Biden, former President Clinton and wife, and I think Kamala Harris. Just describe the kinds of people in the room, and was it a partisan group?
Right. So you have members of Congress, and remember that the U.S. Senate is Republican majority, and the U.S. House of Representatives also is Republican majority after this latest election. So you had a lot of Republican lawmakers who are going to be working hand in hand with President Trump, passing key items of his agenda. And so we're very interested to hear the plans that he is laying out. That's when you heard a lot of the applause lines. We also saw, interestingly enough, and this is unusual for a presidential inauguration, we saw a lot of the big business owners here in the United States. Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Elon Musk of X, and many other companies. We saw Mark Zuckerberg of the Meta company. They were in the front rows along with Trump's family, even ahead of his cabinet nominees. So that was a little bit different. And of course, they were very key donors and allies of Trump during the campaign. So they were also applauding his initiatives.
So I listened to his 2017 inauguration speech, and I listened to this, and I was wondering whether we had a more sober Trump. I mean, any differences? This seemed a bit more controlled, but I could be wrong. What was your sense of the difference between what we saw this afternoon and what happened 4 years ago?
I think you saw a more forward-looking Trump, even though he did mention President Biden's term and said that America had gone into decline while President Biden was in the White House. He was talking about bringing America into a new golden age. He was talking about moving forward with an ambitious economy, with putting America first on the global stage, mentioning things like putting a man on Mars, which obviously was resonating with Elon Musk in the room. It was certainly more forward-looking than that speech in 2017. So very, very different in tone.
Wonderful. Now, to the speech proper, a few things caught my attention. He says there will be a push for tariffs on foreign goods. Essentially, will bring in a lot of money. And I'm sure people in Europe and the World Trade Organization and the rest of the world will be worried that the U.S. president wants to raise tariff barriers because he feels America needs to be a manufacturing giant again. I mean, this is not surprising to you, is it? Is this in line with the same things he was campaigning on?
Absolutely. This was mentioned many times by Trump on the campaign trail. And, you mentioned some of the applause lines in the speech and how was that speech received in the rotunda? That line did not get as good of a response. And that's because the Republican Congress may push back a little bit on President Trump on that issue. They usually see eye to eye on most of these issues, but this is one that concerns Republican lawmakers. I've already heard that from them, that they're concerned about the impact this could have on the American economy, on our relationships worldwide. Expect to see some more pushback on that one.
But I did hear a lot of applause on the national energy emergency, the rescinding of the new Green Deal, and the electric vehicle mandate. And then he says, we will drill, baby, we'll drill. That was...
Yeah, that's another key campaign promise that he repeated many times at rallies. And so it was not a surprise, but it certainly got a very good reaction, as you mentioned, in the rotunda.
The issue of immigration has been big in the campaign, and the points around we will no longer arrest and release, but we will keep them in Mexico. Again, a lot of response. How serious is Trump about this immigration reform? Because, it's one of the biggest issues even for those who live outside America. Think about when they think of Trump. How serious is he about the southern border emergency and essentially keeping away what he calls criminals and drug I mean, all kinds of names he calls immigrants. How serious is he with those points?
He is very serious because he's already signed a number of executive orders on this very issue within an hour or two of being sworn in as president. Things that gave him the ability to declare an emergency at the southern border, give him more powers to delegate the military to handle this situation. We know that the app that allows migrants to apply to come into the U.S. has been taken down. So there's no means of doing that anymore. So all of these changes are already happening, and we're not even on to day 2 of the Trump presidency.
A lot of us didn't understand why he kept using the word Liberation Day, but he also said that we were coming back to a revolution of common sense. And it seems to me he meant that in the context of maybe gender identity and stuff like this, because he spoke about how in the US there will be only 2 genders. Am I correct in thinking that words around revolution of common sense have to do more with the social issues of the campaign?
Yeah, I think you're on the right track there with that, having covered the campaign, spoken to many Trump supporters all around the country who often express to me and to other VOA reporters that they're concerned about some of what they would call the woke ideology here in the United States, about transgender people, about some of these social issues that they feel the Democratic Party, liberals in particular, are pushing too far and pushing the country in the wrong direction. And they would say that that's one of the major reasons they voted for President Trump, is that they wanted to see this kind of return to traditional values that he espouses.
One couldn't help but notice that today is Martin Luther King Day. And for those of us in Ghana, we respect him for his fight for civil rights. Quite pleasantly surprised that he sort of made reference to making the American dream a reality, making his dream a reality. But a bit contradictory, because King is more inclusive. And if you listen to some of the things Trump says, they don't sound that inclusive. But he also got a resounding applause for the reference to Martin Luther King. How did you think that would go down, particularly with the African American community?
Well, you know, Trump made the argument all along on the campaign trail that he was reaching out to African American and Hispanic voters, for that matter, and that he was really listening to their concerns about the economy, about the direction the country was going in. So I think that kind of ties into some of the themes he was weaving in on the campaign trail. A little surprising, but certainly a message that was reaching out on this day that remembers Martin Luther King Jr.
And just a couple final points. So Trump is quite enigmatic for a lot of people, because on some of the things he says, you're not really sure whether he means them or he's basically just bluffing, all right? So he makes reference to things around the economy, that he would raise tariffs, but then he wants to lower prices. Basic economy tells us that if you raise tariffs, prices get higher, but he says he's going to deal with inflation. So I'm not really sure where that's headed. Is there clarity on his economic plan?
I think that's part of the discussion that will be going on with Republican lawmakers, and why you saw some concerns from them already, maybe more of a muted response to that part of the speech. That's certainly a discussion that I expect to be covering on Capitol Hill in the coming weeks and months because of those very concerns.
And then, of course, he says his legacy will be a peacemaker and unifier, and yet he's going to build the strongest army in the world. Are we to take it that even though he wants America to be feared, he's more like a pacifist who wants to end wars? Has that also been consistent in his messaging?
No, I think that there's a common American argument that argues that peace comes through strength, and that if you have a show of strength on the global stage, that's one effective way of keeping our enemies away from attacking us. He would also argue that he's trying to end the conflict in Ukraine, and you know, his coming presidency played a part in the ceasefire of the Gaza conflict. It is certainly the argument that I hear from Republican lawmakers when I'm up on Capitol Hill, that, you know, Trump is showing strength when the Biden presidency has shown weakness. That's their argument. Democrats, of course, would push back on that argument, but that is what they would see in his speech today.
Trump is very popular in some African countries, not just because he looks like a strongman leader, but also on some of the social issues that are very divisive. So a lot of conservative Africans support his view on LGBTQ. They think there should be only two genders. And they kind of sort of support his views on abortion and the rest of it. How divisive are those issues in America, and what he talks about schools and what they do to our kids? I mean, what will some of the minority communities be thinking about this speech, and how will it be received?
I think there's going to be a lot of concern, but in terms of that argument about these being divisive issues, these have been divisive issues a lot longer in the American conversation since the 70s and 1980s, when, you know, there's these so-called culture wars where social issues started to be debated more and more in political discussion. And that's certainly something that we've seen rise even more with the rise of Donald Trump. So it's part of a broader discussion that's been going on in the United States for a long time.
Finally, in your report, you said today was both a day of inauguration and speeches, but also a day of work for President Trump. So what has he been up to since he officially took over office? And has he actually signed any of those key executive orders that he promised to?
He has signed some of those executive orders that we talked about immigration. He is currently making his way to the arena in downtown D.C., where they'll hold the inaugural parade indoors, of course, because of the extreme cold. And he's expected to sign even more executive orders there. So he'll be making news throughout the day.
Thank you for your time and for your great coverage, Catherine and the team at the VOA. We appreciate it.
Absolutely, as always.
Wonderful. Catherine Gibson is the VOA's congressional correspondent, and she brought an initial report telling us about the cold weather and why this inauguration of President Trump would happen indoors. And if I have time, I'll play you some more highlights, because the first clip got truncated, just to see some of the things President Trump said, because it was quite an interesting speech where he was clear about what he wanted to do. He spoke about immigration, spoke about the economy, bringing prices down, spoke about drilling oil, spoke about reversing the automobile EV Act or mandate. And that's quite interesting, because Elon Musk, one of his key supporters, he became famous for Tesla, which is an electronic vehicle. And Trump is going back to drilling, which a lot of the people on the left do not really think is the way to go. So quite a lot of interesting punchlines in that speech. Of interest in Ghana, obviously, the gender issue, where he says there are only two genders, because we do know that in many parts of the world, the discussion is about whether somebody is male, female, or even essentially non-designated and other types of genders. So take a short break from the point of view and bring you a few more highlights of President Trump. Later on, our parliament here in Ghana has been vetting 3 nominees. We spent some time discussing the performance of Honorable Govins Kwame Agboja with the former Roads Minister. Vivian did that interview. But also talk about performance of Haruna Idrisu, the brevity of his vetting, and also the vetting of the nominee for agriculture. All of those and more when we come back from tonight's live edition of The Point of View. Stay with us.